The year is 1990, and we are riding the school bus. I'm 6 years old. The bus bounces and winds through the neighborhood. We pick up a few more kids, all of us bound for Coquillard Elementary School. We're kindergartners, and we're just learning to read. That means that the world outside the school bus window is almost magical, filled with words on billboards and flashing marquees outside of businesses announcing their sales and promotions. But mostly there are street signs. The green, narrow rectangles usually filled with a single word at a time. Sometimes easy words like Elm or Maine. Sometimes harder words like Burgoyne or Donmoyer or Lafayette, all of them enchanting. But to my kindergarten mind, they don't all make sense. Someday, I think, when I'm older, I'll know what they all mean. But I won't. We turn right on Sunwood, which is not a type of tree that actually exists. Then it's on to Southlee, a road that I assume is named the way it is because it's 1,000 feet south of Northlee. After that, a right onto Lilac. Now, there's something I know, something I can hang on to, but then they get weird again. I don't know who Maze is, and I've never heard of a shellbark before, but many years later, Google will tell me it's a subspecies of a hickory tree. Then come the big ones. My school bus turns right onto Cleveland, and then we pause at an intersection before we turn left onto Portage. There will be a superstore and banks and a half-dozen fast food restaurants at this intersection in the years to come, but on this day in 1990, it's all farmland, a small cemetery, a barn that seems like it's been there forever and will stand forevermore, but it won't. I don't remember if there was even a traffic light at the intersection in those days. The school bus jostles south down Portage Road, past the Indian Springs apartments and past Portage Manor. I, and all of my school bus friends, were sure that the manor was the kind of enormous mansion we read about in stories and saw in movies. Of course, we were wrong about that too. The bus threads a needle down what used to be a much narrower Portage Road between a pair of historic cemeteries. To our right, the famed Council Oak is still standing, but it won't remain for much longer. A year later, it will come down in a storm, and none of us on that school bus will have ever seen it when we knew why it was important. And then, a right turn. Every school bus I ever rode to every school I ever attended made this right turn, a full 90 degrees onto Lathrop Street. The routes would diverge from there to Coquillard, to Kennedy, to Dickinson, to LaSalle, but from my house to Lathrop, it was always exactly the same. So much has changed along that old bus route in the past few decades. Portage and Lathrop are controlled by a roundabout now, but one thing, and pretty much just one thing, has stayed the same: the street names. In the second grade, I would learn about the fellow who Lathrop Street was named after, none other than Lathrop Minor Taylor, one of the two primary founding fathers of South Bend. It wasn't until I was into my mid-30s that I realized how very strange it was that the street was given the man's first name. Hello and welcome to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum in South Bend. I'm your host, Aaron Helman, and during the next 8 episodes, we are going to go for a drive around South Bend, and we're going to tell the important, zany, strange, and unexpected tales behind just a few of its streets. During the course of this episode, you'll hear fictional advertisements for very real historical companies and products. We do that to help break up the podcast, provide some levity, to include just a little more history than we could otherwise, and to give you a sense of the time and place when and where all of this is happening. The absence of actual paid advertisements is made possible by the generous underwriting of all 8 episodes in the series by the Doug Hunt family. And now, with all that out of the way, let's pause for a moment near the Highland Cemetery. Let's look at the sign that carries Mr. Taylor's first name, and let's consider what a very weird thing that really is. I mean, think about it. Can you think of another street that carries a man's first name instead of his last name? I'll give you a second. It turns out there are actually a few of them in South Bend. And don't worry, every time we encounter one, I will go out of my way to tell you how weird it is. Incredibly, we're going to stumble upon two of them in this episode, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. The important thing is, this is weird. There's a reason we have Lincoln Way instead of Abraham Avenue. It's Washington Street, not George Boulevard. We cross the bridge on LaSalle Street, not René Robert Cavalier Sourde Street. And thank God for that. So, when we see a street given someone's first name instead of his last name, it should always cause us to wonder, why? It turns out there's usually a good reason, and in this case, our wondering will be rewarded with quite a tale. It starts with Lathrop Minor Taylor. Taylor was born outside Syracuse, New York on February 4th, 1805, but his family wasn't predispositioned to stay in one place for very long. They moved first to Detroit. After that, Cleveland, Sandusky, and Fort Wayne. When he came of age, Taylor went into business with his sister's husband, Samuel Hanna, where his work as a fur trader gave him cause to press the edges of the expansion of the United States. Taylor settled in what would later become South Bend in 1827 as an agent of the American Fur Company. He came to find profit and to make money. It's not known if he originally intended to build a town and live there for the balance of his life, but that's exactly what he did. Along with Alexis Coquillard, Taylor is considered one of the co-founders and co-fathers of South Bend. He was a successful trader, a successful businessman, an early South Bend dignitary, and the first postmaster of the new town. In other words, he's exactly the kind of man you would expect a city to name a road after. The only problem was, they'd already given away his name. By the 1840s, Lathrop Taylor was one of the most important men in South Bend, but he was far from the most well-known guy with the last name Taylor. That honor belonged to General Zachary Taylor, a household name renowned for his military exploits in the War of 1812 and in the Mexican-American War. He was also something of a minor hero across Indiana. Taylor had successfully defended Terre Haute's Fort Harrison against an attack from Tecumseh, the Americans' first land victory of the War of 1812. His heroism earned him a brevet promotion, the first such honor awarded in the history of the United States. For a while there, Zachary Taylor was probably the most famous American outside of the president, at least until 1848, when Taylor won the presidency for himself, despite his lack of political experience and, indeed, his lack of political conviction. It hadn't been necessary for Taylor to win the presidency to get a South Bend street named in his honor. In fact, it had already been there for a decade by the time of the man's inauguration. The original Taylor Street was named General Taylor Street, and at one point in time, it described the westernmost edge of what was then the far west side of South Bend. Taylor's presidency was a short one. On Independence Day, 1850, Zachary Taylor is alleged to have eaten a pile of contaminated cherries. He passed away a few days later, becoming the second American president to die in office. Taylor's abbreviated presidency is not considered successful by most political historians, and he is one of the only presidents to be more famous in the eyes of his contemporaries for something other than his presidency. That's at least part of the reason why South Bend continued to refer to South Bend's Taylor Street as General Taylor Street, even after the man attained that highest office, and for 30 years after the president's death. For the people of South Bend, that meant that christening a Taylor Street was a no-go when it came to honoring Lathrop Minor Taylor. Fortunately for them, the man still had two other names they could choose from.
Attention! The co-partnership heretofore existing between Samuel Hanna and Lathrop M. Taylor, trading under the name Hanna and Taylor, has been dissolved by mutual consent. Henceforth, L.M. Taylor will trade in general goods as his own businessman and has just received a general assortment of dry goods, groceries, hardware, books, stationery, liquors, paints, oils, iron, and window glass, all of which will be sold as low as any goods in the county. And now, back to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum.
By the 1870s, Lathrop Minor Taylor might have hardly recognized the South Bend or the nation that he called home. Since he arrived on the scene back in 1827, the United States had started and ended a civil war. Another president had died in office, although this most recent one was an assassination at the end of John Wilkes Booth's gun. A newspaper man from South Bend named Schuyler Colfax had ascended to the vice presidency of the United States, and a young company headed by the Studebaker family was starting to become a national vehicle manufacturing juggernaut. South Bend was making a splash on the world stage, and it must have been surreal for Lathrop Minor Taylor to see all of it happening. He was just the third white man to settle in the area, and the other two were already dead. Alexis Coquillard in 1855 and Pierre Navarre in 1864. Taylor was there when the city was platted. He was there when it was incorporated. He watched as it reached east of the river and swallowed the burgeoning town on the other side, and now he watched as the city grew toward, and in combination with, the small Catholic school that had been founded on marshland just a few decades earlier. Notre Dame's Father Sorin had helped construct a handful of neighborhoods himself. At the start, they'd been just south of the school. Now, they were fully a part of South Bend, and investors saw them as prime real estate. By the 1880s, developers seized on that prime real estate near campus in much the same way that they've seized it all over again in the last 20 years. One of the first men on the scene was a guy named Minor Listenberger. Listenberger had been born in South Bend in 1848, but by the time he was 4, his family was sick with gold fever, and so they packed up and headed for California. They endured the kinds of difficulties you would have expected during those times, including a Native American attack that put an arrow into Minor's father's chest, but that somehow did not kill him. Fueled by either success or disappointment, the family returned to South Bend in time for young Minor to receive his education in South Bend's public schools, and then at Notre Dame. Whether funded by gold money or just plain hard work, Listenberger made a splash on South Bend's business scene. His first move was to buy some property at 119 South Michigan Street, across the way from the current South Bend Chocolate Cafe. On one side of the building, he started selling real estate and insurance. On the other side, he opened a grocery store. He ran several businesses from those buildings, but mostly what he did was buy real estate. A lot of real estate. Listenberger bought whole city blocks, carved new streets, and crammed new houses into the empty spaces between the old ones. It was all enough to warrant its own distinction in the deed books. M.E. Listenberger's first edition is what they called it, and since there was a first one, you already know there was a second one too. Now in those days, there were 2 ways for a local figure to get a street named after him. The first was to be important, but dead. The second was to own the land the street was on, and Minor Listenberger had land in scads. What he did not have, apparently, was a last name that would easily fit on a road sign. So in 1888, South Bend christened Minor Street, another oddball thoroughfare given a man's first name instead of his last, to carve a short path in the gap between the university and the city. During the next few years, that gap would vanish altogether, and Listenberger's personal fortune would soar. When Listenberger passed away in 1915, he was considered one of the city's most prominent businessmen. It's maybe a small degree of irony, at least so far as this podcast is concerned, that when Minor Listenberger died, he was living at a house on Taylor Street.
Remember that Listenberger Brothers is the best place to get your teas, coffees, sugars, and provisions of all kinds. We keep on hand an immense variety of staple and fancy groceries. Why, just the other day we received several sacks of the best Rio coffee and 20 boxes of raisins. And as always, Listenberger Brothers has the best prices in town. And now, back to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum.
By 1888, South Bend had a Taylor Street and a Minor Street, but neither were named after Lathrop Minor Taylor, a fellow who was one of the two most important individuals in the city's founding. But at least there was a pretty good reason for it. I mentioned earlier that there were two ways for a local person to get a street named after them. The first was to own your own neighborhood, which Taylor didn't. The second was to be important and dead, which Taylor wasn't. Not yet, anyway. It was 1892 when Lathrop Minor Taylor at last met his end. He was 87. He was the third European-descended pioneer to find his way to the area that would become South Bend. The city he helped found had a population of 22,000 when he died. He'd outlived most of his founding-era peers by a number of decades. The South Bend Tribune spilled a lot of ink on Taylor's obituary, much of it recounting his role in establishing his trading post, establishing the town, and laying down the foundation for what would become the city of South Bend. They closed the piece by writing that Lathrop Minor Taylor was just the kind of man for a pioneer. He was not a speculator. He was farsighted and worked for the future of the town he founded and for the benefit of its people. He was, above all else, honest to the fraction of a cent in his dealings. It is a record his son and daughters may be proud of. If that sounds like the kind of man who deserves to have a street named after him, you're exactly right. But if you're thinking that the city must have moved quickly to honor him after he was buried, well, you're wrong about that one. It was August of 1931, nearly 30 years after Taylor's death and more than a century after he'd arrived here, that they finally made the move to give him a street. South Bend had by that time grown to a population of more than 100,000, and there was plenty of confusion surrounding a street grid that had been assembled piecemeal and roughshod along with expansion. There were too many places where one street had too many names, and plenty of other places where one name was shared across two different streets. Council members had plenty of work to do to make their city easier to navigate, but it did give them an opportunity to correct a wrong that had been lingering since 1892. Lathrop Minor Taylor would have his own street, but it was going to be just a little complicated to do it. For starters, they'd have to use his first name, for all of the reasons we've spent this whole podcast talking about. And then, more inconveniently, they were going to have to take that road name from someone else. Remember when I said earlier that so much changes except the street names? It turns out those changed too. The original Lathrop Street was called Wilson Avenue, but that created plenty of confusion since South Bend also had a Wilson Street on the city's west side. Now it has neither. The west side Wilson Street became Harris Street. The one on the north side of the city became Lathrop, long before my school bus ever had cause to ride it, but several years after such a street should have been made to exist. Hey, thanks for joining us on A Bend in Time presented by the History Museum in South Bend. There's more history waiting for you at historymuseumsb.org. I'm your host, Aaron Helman. The theme music is Whose Distance Is It Anyway by Neil Carmichael. Thanks again to the Doug Hunt family for underwriting this episode and all 8 episodes in this series. In our next episode, we're going to check in on a pair of streets named after a few of South Bend's now forgotten political heroes, and I hope you'll tune in for that one next. Until then, keep learning new things, and remember, everything is fascinating as long as you stay curious.